When working with the animation systems and the assets inside of Unreal Engine, we have a few common editors that have been designed to help speed up our animation workflow. Now, the nice thing is there's a bunch of different components and they each have their own editor, but we can easily get to them all from one place. In our example, inside of our project under Mannequin, Mesh, we have a few of those assets. Now, we're going to want to look at our skeleton, but I'm going to show you something. If we actually open up our skeletal mesh, you notice the animation editor opens up and it shows mesh in the top right. We can click on skeleton and it's going to go and open up the skeleton in its new window. But now we can easily go back and forth between any of these editors for our animation system. So let's go ahead and take a look at the skeleton. The main things to note on our skeleton is we have our skeleton hierarchy here, and we have the ability to right click on any skeleton point. So let's say, for example, it's spine, and we could do things to them. We have the ability to adjust their transforms inside of that skeleton and then save it out, maybe if we need to tweak it just a little bit. Or we have the ability to do things like adding and removing sockets and virtual bones. We're not going to be touching on those in this course, but know those are good ways to do things like maybe you want to add a cape to a back or a sword on a hip. You wanted to add something where you have reference to it. A socket is good for that. These are the basics of our skeleton. The next one is our mesh. We're going to cover the mesh in more detail, but note that this is the actual mesh that surrounds our skeleton that we're going to be working with. Now, in our case, we only have one mesh that we're working with inside of our project. If we had more than one, we'd have the ability to change between different meshes. On the left, you'll notice it shows my skeleton tree, but if we click on Asset Details, we get more information about the mesh we have chosen. Like in our static mesh editor, we can change some things like our materials, level of detail settings, import settings, things that are going to be common between meshes. Something that's unique to the skeletal mesh is going to be things like our physics assets and our lighting assets. Note, we do have some import settings. These only apply when you import. If you were to change any import settings, you'll have to re-import. At the top on our toolbar, we can do a couple things with our mesh. For example, we could preview a default animation. So let's say our idle animation we want to be previewing while we're looking at our mesh. We can create assets based off of this mesh and skeleton setup. This is just a quick shortcut to create things we might want to reuse, like an animation blueprint. This is where we can re-import our mesh as well as any LODs very quickly. You'll notice when I click on items inside of my viewport, it targets the bones. However, if we turn on section selection, now we can target parts. Like, for example, we have the main section, and then we actually have the chest section, which are two different parts of this mesh. Now, if you're using cloth painting, this is where we turn it on and off. You can make a static mesh out of this skeletal mesh. Maybe if you want to use it as a pose, make static mesh will let us do that. And then we can bake out the materials if we need to. Now, if you see this running our preview and we want to change it or disable it, inside of our preview scene selection, right here, we can change some things such as go back to default, use specific reference poses or animations, and change a few things inside of our viewport so it looks different. Next, we have our animation tab. We'll go and open that up. We briefly looked at this earlier when we were looking at our blend spaces animations. We will cover this in more detail in its own module, but note this is where you'll work with your different animations and you'll adjust them. The next tab is our blueprint tab. Again, we looked at this briefly, and we will look at it in more detail in its own video upcoming. But this is where we will control how our animation runs at runtime so we have more dynamic feel to our character. If you have more than one animation blueprint tied to the skeleton, like our mesh and our animation system here, you'll see a drop down and we'll be able to choose different blueprints from this nice menu. Lastly, we have our physics. Since we're using skeletal-based animation, physics in this case isn't really going to be something we're going to cover or needed. But if you're going to do stuff with this skeletal mesh in terms of physics, maybe you need to ragdoll once they've been destroyed, this is where you'll set up your physics assets. At the top, we can see simulate. If we click on it, it's going to simulate this physics asset. So we can see it collapsing because it has nothing holding it up. And the nice thing is next to it, we have the ability to simulate selected, and you'll see just from that point up, because I'm holding on to the bottom parts.